So thanks everybody, and let's get underway. As I said, I'm Stephen Bartos, the Parliamentary Budget Officer. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're delivering this briefing on Gadigal country. Pay respects to the Gadigal elders past and present. Also note that a number of people are joining us from different parts of New South Wales, and we celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal cultures and heritages across the whole of the state and the ongoing connection to the lands and waters of New South Wales of its Aboriginal people. If any of the people joining us are of Aboriginal descent, can we also acknowledge them either in the room or online? Just a few little housekeeping details. We will send you this presentation after the session, and also a little video about the work of the PBO. If you are joining online, there is a chat facility, so you can ask questions in the chat facility, ask them any time during the course of the presentation, and we will make sure that we answer them in the Q&A section at the end. And for those here in the Parliament, of which I will confess to our online people is not a vast number, but nonetheless, there will be afternoon tea available. So let's start with what is the Parliamentary Budget Office. Under the Parliamentary Budget Office Act, we establish a Parliamentary Budget Office in this state every 4 years. It's very much focused on accountability of the major parties in advance of the election. So it's established for the election. And what it does is it publishes the costs of the election promises that are made by the government and by the opposition prior to the election. And that allows voters to know the impact of the promises on the finances of New South Wales. That is, the government finances of New South Wales. The legislative foundation is the Parliamentary Budget Officer Act, which was passed in 2010, which establishes the role of the PBO as an independent officer of the Parliament. And that's important. The PBO is not part of the executive arm of government. We don't answer to any ministers. We can't be directed by the government as to what to put in our costings, which, if you're in opposition, is obviously a darn good thing, because it means that you know that the PBO is independent. It's not subject to direction. New South Wales was the first jurisdiction in Australia to have a PBO. It was followed by the Commonwealth in 2012 and Victoria in 2017. And uniquely amongst the Australian PBOs, New South Wales is the only one that publishes the costs of policies before the election. The Commonwealth publishes some costs of some policies a month after the election. Victoria publishes some costs of some policies 2 months after the election. We publish them prior to the election, which means that people can be informed before the election about what everything is going to cost. We cost, and this is the words from the Act, announced or proposed election policies for the Premier and the Leader of the Opposition. And that's all we cost policies for. We don't cost policies for individual members of Parliament. We don't cost policies for minor parties. We don't cost policies for independents. We don't cost policies even for ministers or shadow ministers. All the work of the PBO is funnelled through the Premier or the Leader of the Opposition. And we apply exactly the same approach, very even-handedly, to both the Premier and the Leader of the Opposition. Absolutely equivalent processes apply to each leader. The PBO Act requires every leader to have all of their election policies costed. So they are required under the Act to submit every single one of their policies that they propose to implement after the election to the PBO to be costed. They nominate representatives to liaise with the PBO on their behalf. So as the PBO, I'm not talking with Chris Minns or Dominic Perrottet. They nominate representatives of their office to work with the PBO. The policy costings are published when the leader notifies the PBO that the policy has been announced. This is sometimes an issue that gives rise to comments from members of the media, because they have receive the media release, they know a policy's been announced, and they say, where's the costing? The costing doesn't come out until the leader actually tells us that the policy has been announced. So even though it is obvious that it has been announced by reading the Daily Telegraph or listening to the radio, you have to wait, the PBO has to wait until we're told that the policy is announced before we can publish it. And what is a costing? A costing is the best estimate we can make of the impact of a policy on what are known as the forward estimates. That's what's published in the budget in New South Wales every year and is about to be published in the half-yearly review in New South Wales on February 7th. It sets out what the state of the New South Wales finances are, so the revenues the government's going to get, the spending the government's going to make in both the current year that we're in and in each year for the next 3 years afterwards. And we look at expenses, we look at revenue, and we look separately, because there are different accounting rules that apply to it, to capital spending. That is things like buildings, major construction projects. That's capital spending. And we report on the impact on the budget and on the total finances of the state. There are some policies that have an impact on the state's finances but have zero impact on the budget. For example, policies to do with state-owned corporations. Their operations, which are done largely commercially and at arm's length from the budget, can still have an impact in terms of total state finances, but don't necessarily have an impact on the budget. The costings outline all of the assumptions that are made in calculating the costs. So what we do is cost the likely cost over the current and forward estimates years using the latest Treasury update as the baseline. Obviously, the latest Treasury update today is the budget. That's the latest bit of public information Treasury's released. After February 7th, the latest Treasury update will be the half-yearly review. And we look at how much a policy that's proposed by either the government or the opposition changes that budget baseline. And it can change it in two ways. It can change it by spending more, or it can change it by saving money. Either way, it's a policy that has to be costed. We obtain information often from government agencies to help us costing a policy, and we have a small team of really very capable and expert staff who are seconded to us from both the New South Wales Parliament and also from various New South Wales government agencies. One thing that's important to emphasise here is that the costings can vary enormously depending on the assumptions that you make. Assumptions, for example, about what's the date on which the new policy is going to start, or how many people are going to be eligible for a new government spending program. Those sorts of things make a big difference to how much they cost. The assumptions are set by the parliamentary leaders. So when they send us a policy to cost, they also spell out any assumptions behind them. As a general rule, we accept those assumptions because it's the parliamentary leaders who are making the policies. Either the ALP or the coalition have come up with the policies, and they know what assumptions they want to make in terms of what that policy is going to involve. Although sometimes we'll query the assumption. For example, if whoever submits the policy has made a mistake in their assumption, it can be a really simple mistake, like they mean the policy to start in 2024 and they write in it's going to start in 1924. We'll say, you've made a mistake there. You can't retrospectively backdate your policy 100 years. Or the assumption might be unrealistic. So the example I like to use is if a parliamentary leader were to come to us, and I don't believe any would, but if they were to come to us and say, we can build a new 300-bed hospital for a cost of $10 million, we would say to them, that's unrealistic, you can't do that. That you can't make as an assumption in your policy. We also adjust all of our estimates for factors like economic growth, inflation and population that have an impact on future costs. We also outline for our costings risks and uncertainties, because often we cannot predict the future and we cannot know exactly how many people will take up a new benefit, how much a new building is going to cost, how long a major project will take to complete. So we'll set out in the costing what those risks are. So the costing is our best estimate when we do the costing of what those costs are going to be for the budget, but we do know that there are risks and uncertainties, and we outline those in notes to the costing. And something to bear in mind for the media is that the further out you go, the greater the risks and uncertainties. So predicting next year is difficult. Predicting 2025-26 is much more difficult. The further out in time you go, the greater the risks and uncertainties in policies are. Confidentiality is a key element of what the PBO does. By law, under the Parliamentary Budget Officer Act, both the PBO and agency staff are required to keep information highly confidential, and penalties apply for any unauthorised disclosure. So if we go to a department asking for help to cost a policy, they're not allowed to talk about it with anyone. PBO staff don't talk about it with anyone. Ensuring confidentiality is absolutely vital for two reasons. One, it helps politicians trust the advice that we give them. The information that we give them for a costing after they announce a policy will then become public, but before they announce it and before they tell the PBO that they have announced it, it remains confidential. And that has a second benefit, and this is a really important one. It allows parties to consider different options. So they get costings of lots of different options of things, and they choose the one that's most cost effective. Some of them may be stupidly cost ineffective, just cost vast amounts more than they might have thought. They will leave those aside. They won't be embarrassed because those never get released. They remain confidential forever. It allows, therefore, the parties to choose the most cost-effective policies to present to the people of New South Wales, and people of New South Wales win as a result of that. So the confidentiality is really important for that process of iterative development of policy. That is, parties think of policies, get the PBO to cost them, find out how much they cost, rethink them, get them recosted again, and the ones that aren't used remain confidential forever. Big publication that tells the voters in New South Wales and tells the media, and we rely on the media to disseminate this information out to people in New South Wales, is budget impact statements published 5 days before the election. They add up everything that's been submitted for costing. And as I mentioned before, by law, that has to be all of the election policies of both major parties. So we provide a total of what the impact is on the budget and on New South Wales finances as a whole for both the government and the opposition. So that sums it all up. And we also make sure that at the time we publish the budget impact statement, we'll publish all of the individual costings if they haven't previously been published in some other form. So if they haven't already gone out, because the leader has told us they want them to go out, they will in any case be published at the time of the budget impact statement. So all the full information is there for people to look at in that period 5 days before the election. So all of these procedures are published on our website. Remember, we're sending you this presentation so you can see the link to our website there. Work in progress is confidential and we don't discuss it. And we hope that once we publish the costing, we won't need to discuss it either because it'll be self-explanatory. It'll set out all the workings, it'll set out all the information you need to understand how the cost was worked out by the PBO. But if you do have queries about it, after the costing is published, we welcome being contacted. Happy to talk with anyone from the media if there's something in the costing that's unclear. What we don't do is we don't comment on the merits of the policy. So if there's a policy that's presented by the government or the opposition and the media asks us, does the PBO think this is a good policy or does the PBO think this is a bad policy? We will not comment. That's up to voters to decide. That's not up to the PBO. We'll just tell you what it costs. If one or other of the major parties, or in fact if anyone, including representatives of media or any other sort of commentator, makes a statement that misrepresents the work of the PBO, we can issue a public statement about that. I'm very pleased to say that there have been no misrepresentations of the PBO work to date in 2022 or 2023. So that's the presentation. That outlines how things are going to work. Let me just remind people that the purpose of this presentation is we have no expectation that you'll write a story about this briefing. This is so that when it comes to the publication of costings, you know what's gone on underneath the hood, how the engines work them through, and you've got that background so you understand how these things came about. So if you have any questions about the process or about the PBO and how we go about it, this is your opportunity. Including, remember, online people, there's a chat box where you can ask your questions.
The policies that great, thanks. Have the policies that the opposition leader and the Premier announced so far been costed already?
I can't tell you. The reason I can't tell you is we are confidential, not just about the content of policies, about even whether we've worked on them, until that time arrives when the Premier or the Leader of the Opposition tells us that we can release them. So, and obviously the fact that we haven't published anything on our website tells you right now that they haven't told us that they have announced their policies. So this falls into the category of, although we know that there are a lot of policies being announced, we can't talk about them until one or other leader tells us that they've been published. And to be honest, we're at the moment in a stage that reminds me a little bit about penguins on the Antarctic ice shelf. When they're wanting to jump into the ocean, they all crowd along the edge of the shelf, waiting until the first penguin jumps in case there's a leopard seal underneath. No one wants to be the first to jump in. Same with releasing your PBO costings. No one wants to be the first because they don't know how they'll be, what the reaction will be, how they'll be treated. So they wait for each other to go first.
What would happen in a circumstance where when you release the pre-election budget statement, there were policies that either party hadn't told you could release? Like, do you just do it anyway, or?
No, if they haven't told us they can. So the process for doing the budget impact statement is that 15 days before the election, both leaders have to give us their final official list of all of their approved policies. Now, if we've done some costings of them and they don't include them in their list of official policies, we will use that. So if you do the maths, 15 days before the election, they give us their list. 5 days before the election, we publish the budget impact statement. We have 10 days in which we can go back to the leaders' offices and say, hey, have you forgotten this one? What about that one? And make sure that that the list is complete. Now, if, and this is a circumstance that under law shouldn't happen, but if a leader were to announce a policy and not submit it for costing, there are no actual formal sanctions because under the PBO Act, there's no liability on either the Premier or the Leader of the Opposition. However, there's a very strong political sanction because you can be sure that both sides will be scrutinising the budget impact statements, and if somebody's announced a policy but not made it part of their official list, they will be pilloried for it by the other side. So what that means is that in practice, they've got a really strong incentive to make sure their list is complete. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think I already know the answer to this, but you mentioned those discarded options that don't get released. They aren't subject to the GIPA Act or anything?
No, they're not. Interesting though they might be.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions online at the moment. So just invite anyone online to post any final questions.
Yeah, this is a challenge to the rural media who've been invited to join us online. You can't let your media colleagues from the big smoke take all the questions. You've got to ask something. No?
Don't think we've got any takers at the moment, but
Okay, this is Sydney 1, Country 0. If this was a city versus country football game.
well, I think we can
All right.
wrap it up.
Any other last minute things that you want to have clarified? No? Feel free to join us for some scones. We've got some other members of PBO staff here. Feel free to say hello. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming along to the briefing.